Welcome, survivors, to the edge of the apocalypse, where every story is a fight to stay alive. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for every like, comment, and sub. Keep hitting that bell and join the fight with me. Thanks from the bottom of my heart.
The emergency strobes were the color of arterial spray, rhythmic and pulsing against the slick, weeping walls of Sector 4. I could hear the ocean screaming. Not the waves. No, you don't hear waves 4,000 meters down. You hear the weight. 5,000 pounds of pressure per square inch, groaning against the reinforced titanium hull of the Abyssal 7 research station like a titan trying to crush a soda can. My breath came in ragged, wet hitches, the metallic tang of recycled air and copper thick on my tongue. I pressed my back against the cold bulkhead, my fingers trembling as they gripped a heavy, salt-encrusted pipe wrench. My knuckles were white, my palms slick with a mixture of sweat and the black, viscous oil that had begun leaking from the ventilation grates. 10 minutes ago, I was a maintenance technician. Now I was a ghost waiting for my turn to die. From the shadows of the flooded corridor, a sound emerged that didn't belong to the sea. It was a wet, clicking rattle, the sound of someone trying to swallow their own tongue. That was Miller, or what was left of him. I remember the way Miller used to laugh at the mess hall, loud and boisterous, talking about his daughter's graduation. Now, as he rounded the corner, his gait was a stuttered, bone-snapping lurch. His neck was tilted at an impossible 45-degree angle, the skin gray and translucent like the belly of a deep-sea scavenger. The most terrifying part wasn't the blood on his coveralls, it was the eyes. They were wide, milky, and utterly devoid of anything human, yet they stared with a frantic, twitching hunger that felt personal. He saw me. A low, gurgling moan escaped his throat, a sound of pure agony stripped of all reason. He didn't run. He threw himself forward, his limbs flailing with a violent, unnatural energy. I didn't think. I swung. The wrench connected with the side of his skull with a sickening, hollow thud, the sound of a ripe melon hitting concrete. He collapsed, but he didn't stop. Even with his jaw hanging by a single tendon, he clawed at my boots, his fingernails snapping against the metal floor. I scrambled back, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack. This wasn't a disease. It was an erasure. The virus, or whatever the biology team had pulled from the trench floor, didn't just kill you, it hollowed you out and kept the engine running on spite. I turned and bolted down the darkened hallway, the soles of my boots splashing through ankle-deep water. The station was dying. Every few seconds, a distant explosion muffled by miles of water vibrated through the floorboards. The pressure was winning. If the things in the dark didn't get me, the Atlantic would. I reached the heavy blast door of the hydroponics wing, my hands fumbling with the manual override. Behind me, more shadows were moving. Not just one or two, but a tide of them, their pale skin glowing faintly in the red emergency light like deep-sea jellyfish. I could hear the frantic scratching of their nails on the walls, a sound that bypassed my ears and went straight to the base of my spine. The door groaned open just enough for me to squeeze through. I slammed it shut and spun the locking wheel, the screech of metal on metal echoing in the hollow silence of the garden. Here, the air was humid and smelled of rotting vegetation. The rows of genetically modified soy and lettuce were overgrown, their long tendrils hanging down like nooses in the dark. I slumped against the door, my chest heaving. Silence. For a moment, there was only the sound of the water dripping from the ceiling. Then, a soft, wet sloshing from the far end of the room. Something was moving among the plants. Not the frantic, mindless lunges of the infected I'd seen in the corridors, but something slower, more deliberate. I held my breath, the silence becoming a physical weight. I thought about the surface, sunlight, wind, things I would never see again. We were supposed to be the pioneers of the deep, unlocking the secrets of eternal life from the extremophiles in the Hadal Zone. Instead, we'd found something that hated life. I watched a shadow detach itself from the greenery. It was Dr. Aris, the head of the pathology lab. She was standing perfectly still, her back to me. Her lab coat was shredded, and she was hunched over a large nutrient vat. I wanted to call out to her, to hope that she was still there, but then I saw what she was doing. She was systematically plunging her hands into the vat and pulling out handfuls of the dark, poolsing sludge we'd recovered from the trench. shoving it into her mouth with a rhythmic, mechanical devotion. When she turned around, her face was gone. In its place was a blooming black mass of fungal-like growths that mimicked the shape of a human jaw, pulsating with a faint, bioluminescent violet light. She didn't have eyes anymore, but she looked right at me. The thing that used to be Eris let out a high-pitched, harmonic shriek that shattered the glass of the nearby seed cases. It wasn't a scream. It was a signal. From the vents above, the walls, and the shadows of the plants, dozens of pale, emaciated shapes began to drop. I realized then that I wasn't hiding. I was cornered. My mind raced through the blueprints of the station. The escape pods were 2 levels down through the main reactor core. It was a suicide mission. But staying here meant becoming part of the garden. I gripped the wrench until my hand cramped, the adrenaline finally overriding the paralyzing terror. I had to move. I kicked a rolling supply cart toward the mass of infected, the metal clattering loudly to draw their attention, and I broke for the service ladder. Every step was a gamble against gravity and the things that were once my friends. I could feel the station tilting, a slow, agonizing list to the port side. The hull was failing. As I climbed the ladder, a hand caught my ankle, a cold, clammy grip that felt like wet leather. I looked down and saw a young intern, his face half-eaten, looking up at me with a strange, weeping expression. He wasn't trying to bite. He was trying to pull me down into the dark with him, a desperate, lonely gesture that was more horrifying than any violence. I kicked him off, the guilt a hot needle in my gut, and scrambled into the vent. The crawlspace was narrow, smelling of dust and ozone. I moved on hands and knees, the sound of the infected scratching at the metal plating beneath me like rats in a wall. I reached a grate that overlooked the reactor core and peered through. The sight made my blood turn to ice. The entire floor was covered in a carpet of the infected, hundreds of them, standing perfectly still and facing the reactor. They were humming, a low, vibrating drone that matched the frequency of the station's power core. They weren't just monsters, they were a hive and they were waiting for something. I realized the virus wasn't just spreading, it was terraforming the station. The heat from the reactor was being used to incubate something in the center of the room, a massive, translucent sac filled with thousands of twitching, dark shapes. My exit was on the other side of that room. I checked my oxygen levels on my wrist display. 10%. The air in the vents was thinning, the CO2 scrubbers likely clogged with the same black growth I'd seen in hydroponics. I had to cross that floor. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart, and began to unscrew the grate. Every turn of the screw felt like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. Just as the last screw fell, a massive tremor shook the station. A bulkhead had finally given way. I heard the roar of the ocean, a distant, muffled thunder, and then the lights went out completely. In the absolute darkness of the deep sea, the only thing I could see were the thousands of glowing, violet eyes of the infected below, all turning upward toward me at once. They knew I was there. I dropped through the grate, not knowing if I'd hit the floor or their waiting arms, praying for a quick end but knowing in this place there was no such thing as mercy. The fall felt like an eternity, a breathless plunge into a void that smelled of stagnant salt and the copper tang of old blood. I didn't hit the floor. Instead, I slammed into the cold, unyielding edge of a heavy-duty transport crate, the impact driving what little air I had left out of my lungs in a silent, agonizing wheeze. My wrist display flickered, 9%. The red warning light was the only thing I could see besides those eyes, 1,000 points of malevolent violet light swirling in the dark like stars in a nightmare galaxy. I rolled off the crate, my boots splashing into 3 inches of freezing seawater. The breach wasn't just a threat anymore. It was a reality. The station was drinking the ocean, and the ocean was heavy enough to crush us all into paste. I stayed low, my hands fumbling across the wet floor until they closed around a heavy, discarded spanner. It wasn't a gun, but it was solid, and in the claustrophobic dark of the deep-sea lab, weight was better than nothing. The violet eyes began to move. They didn't run. They glided, their movements fluid and sickeningly graceful, adapted to the high-pressure environment in a way no human should be. I could hear the wet slap of their feet on the flooded floor, a rhythmic, predatory sound that drowned out the distant roar of the incoming sea. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it would break. I reached for my utility belt, my fingers trembling as I found the last chemical flare. I cracked it. The world exploded into a harsh, flickering crimson. For a second the infected recoiled, their translucent skin shimmering under the red light. They were horrific, bloated, their flesh pale and waxy, crisscrossed with those same glowing violet veins I'd seen in the hydroponics samples. Their eyes weren't just glowing. They were pulsating, the pupils gone, replaced by a crystalline growth that seemed to catch and refract the flare's light. There were dozens of them crowded between the research stations and the heavy machinery of the atmospheric scrubbers. They weren't mindless, though. They didn't just charge. They circled, their heads tilting in a synchronized bird-like motion, communicating through low-frequency clicks that I felt in my teeth rather than heard with my ears. I didn't wait for them to finish their assessment. I bolted. I knew this room. It was the secondary life support hub. If I could reach the manual override for the pressure doors on the far side, I could seal this section off and buy myself enough time to reach the escape pods in the moon pool. But the water was rising fast, now swirling around my calves, dragging at my movements. The cold was a physical weight, a numbing needle that sank into my marrow. I swung the spanner at the first shape that lunged out of the red haze. The metal connected with a sickening crunch against a jawbone, sending a spray of black, viscous fluid across my visor. The creature didn't scream. It didn't even slow down. It just fell back into the water, its violet eyes still fixed on me as it began to pull itself back up with unnatural strength. I scrambled over a fallen server rack, the oxygen warning on my wrist now a steady, mocking vibration. 8%. My lungs burned, a deep, searing ache that made every breath feel like I was inhaling ground glass. The CO2 was building up, making the edges of my vision fray into static. I threw the flare toward the center of the room to distract them, the red light bouncing off the rising water, and dived into the shadows of the ventilation machinery. I moved like a ghost, or tried to, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I could hear them splashing behind me, their clicks growing more frantic, more urgent. They were hunting by vibration now, sensing the ripples I left in the freezing brine. I reached the pressure door control panel, my hands slick with sweat and seawater. The power was out, the screen dark and dead. I had to use the manual crank. I jammed the spanner into the emergency release slot and began to turn. Each rotation was a Herculean effort, my muscles screaming in protest as the heavy steel door began to groan shut. The screech of metal on metal was like a dinner bell. The violet eyes converged. One of them, a creature that might have been a lab technician once, judging by the tattered remains of a white coat fused to its skin, lunged through the gap. Its fingers were elongated, the nails replaced by jagged, calcified protrusions. It clawed at my chest, the sharp points dragging across my suit's reinforced fabric with a sound like a knife on a chalkboard. I kicked out, my boot catching it in the chest, pushing it back just enough to throw my weight against the crank for the final turn. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the entire station, the seals hissing as they engaged. I was alone in the corridor, the silence suddenly so loud it made my ears ring. I slumped against the door, the spanner falling from my nerveless fingers. 7%. I looked at the corridor ahead. It was a long, narrow throat of corrugated steel, lit only by the flickering blue of the emergency floor strips. The water here was shallower, but it was flowing in a steady stream from the ceiling panels. The station was deforming under the weight of the abyss. I could hear the hull screaming, a high-pitched metallic wail that told me the structural integrity was measured in minutes, not hours. I started to walk, my legs heavy and clumsy. The psychological toll was starting to breach my defenses. I thought of the surface, the sun, the wind, the simple act of breathing without a suit. It felt like a dream from another life, a fantasy created by a dying brain. I passed a viewing port and stopped for a second, compelled by a morbid curiosity. Outside, in the crushing dark of the midnight zone, the station's exterior lights were still operational, casting long, wavering beams into the water. Thousands of them, the infected, were clinging to the outside of the glass. They weren't trying to break in. They were waiting. They were watching the station die, their violet eyes reflecting the light like a carpet of neon gems. They knew the water would bring them their meal. They knew the pressure would eventually do the work for them. I tore my eyes away and kept moving. The moon pool was just through the next bulkhead. I could hear the churning of the water there, the sound of the ocean reclaiming its territory. My display buzzed again, 5%. The air was thick and tasted of ozone and rot. I felt lightheaded, a dangerous euphoria bubbling up in my chest. I knew what it was, hypoxia. My brain was starting to shut down, losing its grip on reality. I saw figures in the shadows that weren't there, my colleagues, my friends, all waving me toward the dark. I shook my head, the motion making the world spin. I had to stay focused. I reached the moon pool chamber and stopped dead. The room was a chaotic mess of foam and twisted metal. The central pool, where the submersibles were usually docked, was a geyser of white water, erupting as the pressure equalized. But the submersibles were gone. All of them except one, the Icarus, a deep-sea scout pod designed for extreme depths. It was still tethered to its cradle, swaying precariously as the room flooded. But there was something else in the room. A massive, bloated shape was hunched over the pod's hatch. It was larger than the others, its flesh a translucent gray, its entire back covered in pulsing bioluminescent polyps. It was feeding on something or someone. The sounds of its meal, a wet, rhythmic tearing that made my stomach heave. I had no choice. The Icarus was my only way out, the only thing between me and a watery grave 2 miles down. I gripped the spanner, my knuckles white, 4%. I didn't have the luxury of a plan. I didn't have the strength for a fight. I moved toward the pod, my boots splashing softly in the rising tide. The creature stopped. It didn't turn around, but the polyps on its back began to glow brighter, a deep, angry purple. It let out a sound I hadn't heard before. A low, resonant hum that vibrated in my chest, a call to the others. I didn't wait. I charged, screaming a wordless cry of pure, distilled desperation. I swung the spanner with everything I had left, the metal burying itself in the creature's neck. A spray of violet fluid erupted, blinding me, stinging my eyes even through the visor. The creature roared, a wet, gurgling sound, and swung a massive, mutated arm. It hit me like a freight train, launching me across the room. I hit the far wall and felt something in my shoulder snap. The world went gray. I lay there in the rising water, the cold finally beginning to feel warm, a sure sign of the end. I looked at my wrist, 3%. The display was blurring, the numbers dancing. The creature was coming for me, dragging its massive bulk through the water, its violet eyes fixed on mine with a terrifying intelligence. It wasn't just a monster, it was the next step. It was the abyss made flesh. I fumbled for my belt, my fingers numb and unresponsive. My hand closed around the handle of my emergency welding torch. It was a small, high-intensity tool meant for quick repairs. I ignited it. The blue flame hissed in the damp air, a tiny spark of human defiance in the crushing dark. As the creature lunged, its mouth opening to reveal rows of needle-like teeth, I jammed the torch into one of the pulsing polyps on its chest. The reaction was instantaneous. The bioluminescent fluid inside the creature was volatile. There was a muffled explosion, a burst of purple fire that lit up the entire moon pool. The creature was thrown back. Its chest a blackened ruin, the violet light in its eyes flickering and fading. I didn't stay to watch it die. I dragged myself toward the Icarus, every movement a symphony of agony. I pulled myself up the side of the pod, my fingers slipping on the wet metal. I reached the hatch and hammered on the manual override. It hissed open, and I tumbled inside, the air in the pod smelling of stale grease and old socks, the most beautiful smell I'd ever encountered. I slammed the hatch shut and engaged the seals just as the first of the other infected began to pour into the room through the vents. I crawled into the pilot's seat, my vision tunneling, 2%. I didn't have time for pre-flight checks. I didn't have time for anything. I reached for the emergency release lever, the one that would blow the docking bolts and drop the pod into the moon pool. My hand hovered over the handle. Outside the small, thick viewport, the violet eyes were everywhere, pressing against the glass, hundreds of them, a sea of glowing hatred. They knew I was leaving. They were slamming their bodies against the hull, the sound like hailstones on a tin roof. I looked at my wrist. 1%. The display began to flash a steady, rhythmic red. Oxygen depleted. I felt my lungs seize, my body finally giving up the ghost. I gripped the lever and pulled. There was a series of sharp, metallic cracks as the bolts fired. The Icarus dropped. The sensation of falling returned, but this time it was controlled. The pod hit the churning water of the moon pool and was sucked down into the darkness of the open ocean. The pressure outside was immense, the hull of the pod groaning as it adjusted to the change. I reached for the emergency oxygen mask hanging from the ceiling, my movement slow, like I was moving through molasses. I pressed it to my face and cracked the valve. The first breath was pure heaven. It was cold and dry, but it was life. I slumped back in the seat, watching the lights of the station fade above me. It looked like a dying star, a glowing ember in the vast, uncaring black of the deep sea. I was alive, but as I looked down at my arm, I saw a smear of the violet fluid on my sleeve, right where the creature had clawed me. And underneath the fabric, my skin was beginning to itch. A dull, rhythmic pulse was starting in my veins, a faint violet glow beginning to shimmer under my flesh. I wasn't just escaping the lab. I was taking the nightmare with me. I looked out into the dark, the Icarus drifting further away from the ruins of my life, and I realized that the ocean wasn't the most dangerous thing down here anymore. I was. The silence of the pod was broken only by the sound of my own breathing, and a faint, high-pitched click that seemed to come from the back of my own throat. I closed my eyes, the violet light behind my eyelids growing brighter with every heartbeat, a silent passenger in the dark. The surface was miles away, a world I no longer belonged to, a world that had no idea what was coming up from the depths. I leaned my head against the cold glass, watching the last of the station's lights vanish, and waited for the change to take me completely, a lone spark of violet drifting in the infinite, hungry night. The clicking wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a physical sensation, a rhythmic spasm at the base of my skull that vibrated through my jaw every time I exhaled. I watched my hands, or what used to be my hands, as they gripped the edge of the pilot's console. The skin was becoming translucent, a bruised, milky parchment that allowed the violet fire in my veins to spill through in jagged, lightning bolt patterns. I wasn't just dying, I was being rewritten. The Icarus groaned as the external pressure shifted, the depth gauges on the HUD spinning backward with a frantic, mechanical whir that mirrored the panic tempo of my own heart. Or hearts. There was a secondary pulse now, a heavy, wet thudding in my abdomen, right where the jagged piece of containment glass had sliced me an hour ago. It felt like something was trying to fold itself inside me, a new anatomy carving space out of my soft tissue. The cabin air tasted like ozone and copper, and for the first time in my life, I could see the heat coming off the electronics, swirling eddies of infrared ghosts dancing around the navigation screen. I reached out to touch the glass of the porthole, and my fingernails, now elongated and blackened like obsidian, made a sharp, crystalline sound against the reinforced acrylic. I wasn't cold anymore. The freezing depths of the Hadal zone should have had me shivering, but I felt a terrifying, radiant warmth, as if I were carrying a small, dying star in the center of my chest. A sudden burst of static tore through the pod's internal speakers, a sound so loud it felt like a physical blow to my hypersensitized ears. I collapsed against the seat, clutching my head as the clicking in my throat accelerated into a frantic, high-pitched screech. Icarus 4, do you read? This is topside recovery vessel Acheron. We have your signature on the array. Status report immediately. The voice was thin, distorted by miles of salt water, but I recognized it. It was Miller, my mentor. The man who had convinced me that the Hadal 7 project was about sustainable energy, not biological warfare. I thought he'd been evacuated weeks ago when the first containment shield failed and the screaming started in the lower dorms. I tried to speak, but my tongue felt heavy, bifurcated. I swallowed hard, the taste of brine and something bitter filling my mouth. Miller, I rasped, the word sounding less like a name and more like a growl. The station. Everyone is gone. It's in the water. It's in me. There was a long silence on the other end, the kind of silence that carries the weight of a death sentence. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its frantic edge. It was cold, it was professional. We know, Elias, we've been watching the telemetry from your suit. You're a miracle. You've survived the transition period where the others disintegrated. You're holding the strain. Do not attempt to vent the cabin. We are initiating remote override of your ascent. We're bringing you home. Home? The word felt like a joke. Home was a place for things with skin that didn't glow, for things that didn't feel the sudden, agonizing urge to unhinge their jaws. The Icarus gave a violent lurch as the remote override kicked in, the thrusters firing with a force that pinned me against the back of the seat. We were ascending too fast. The nitrogen in my blood should have been boiling, turning my veins into a network of agonizing bubbles, but the violet light hummed in response, stabilizing me, reinforcing my cellular structure against the change in pressure. I watched the depth gauge, 5,000 meters, 4,003. The darkness outside the pod was no longer empty. In the violet haze of my new vision, I could see them, the things we had accidentally called into existence. They were following the pod, sleek, pale shapes that moved with a terrifying serpentine grace. They weren't just zombies. They were an evolutionary leap, a predatory answer to the crushing weight of the abyss. They were my siblings now, and as they pressed their eyeless faces against the glass, their own violet bioluminescence pulsing in sync with my own, I felt a horrific sense of belonging. They weren't attacking. They were escorting me to the surface. Miller, I whispered, the clicking in my throat now a constant melodic drone. What did you do to us? The radio crackled again. We didn't do anything, Elias. We just opened the door. The organism was already there, waiting in the vents, waiting for a host that could survive the pressure. It's not a virus. It's a blueprint. And you, my boy, are the final draft. Don't fight it. The Acheron is equipped with a level 4 containment biolab. We're going to study how you've integrated. You're going to save the world, even if there's nothing left of Elias Thorne when we're done. The betrayal hit me harder than the pressure. They hadn't failed to save us. They had left us down there to see who would change, to see who would become the asset they needed. The outbreak wasn't an accident. It was a field test. I looked at the console, my vision swimming with overlapping layers of reality. I could see the electrical currents flowing through the wires behind the plastic panels. I could feel the vibrations of the Acheron's engines above, miles away, echoing through the water column. My hands moved of their own accord, my fingers dancing over the keys with a speed and precision I never possessed. I wasn't trying to stop the ascent. I was trying to override the override. I'm not coming in for a landing, Miller, I said, my voice now a dual-tonal resonance that echoed inside the small cabin. The violet glow was so bright now that it was bleeding out of the pod's seams, illuminating the dark water around me like a fallen star. I'm the nightmare you invited in. I'm the thing that comes from the dark. I found the command line I needed. The Icarus was a pressurized vessel, but it was also a bomb if you played with the lithium-ion batteries and the oxygen scrubbers just right. I began to bypass the safety protocols, my mind working with a cold, predatory logic. I could hear Miller's voice growing frantic, demanding to know what I was doing, but his words were just noise now, the meaningless chatter of a lower species. The pressure was dropping rapidly. 2,000 meters. 1,000. The water outside was turning from the bruised purple of the midnight zone to a pale, sickly gray as we approached the surface. Suddenly, the pod shuddered as a massive shape slammed into the side. It wasn't one of the creatures. It was a tether. A mechanical claw from the Acheron had latched onto the Icarus. They were reeling me in. I looked up through the top porthole and saw the hull of a massive ship silhouetted against the pale light of a moonlit sky. We had breached the surface. The pod bobbed violently in the swells, the sound of the waves crashing against the metal, a thunderous roar in my ears. The crane began to lift me. the Icarus swinging through the air like a pendulum. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my chest, a final agonizing expansion. My ribs cracked and shifted, pushing outward to accommodate the new organs that were pulsing with a furious violet light. I fell to the floor of the pod, gasping, my lungs burning as they tried to process the thin, dry air of the surface. It felt like breathing ground glass. The airlock of the Acheron loomed ahead, a yawning metal mouth ready to swallow me. I saw soldiers in hazmat suits, their rifles leveled at the pod. And there, standing behind a thick sheet of reinforced glass on the observation deck, was Miller. He looked older, tired, but his eyes were wide with a greedy, scientific lust. He wasn't looking at me as a human. He was looking at a Nobel Prize. He was looking at the future of warfare. He raised a hand, signaling the crew to begin the decontamination cycle. The pod hissed as it was pulled into the airlock, the outer doors clanging shut with a finality that sounded like a tomb closing. "Welcome home, Elias." Miller's voice came over the internal comms, smooth and triumphant. "Let's see what you've become." The internal pressure of the airlock equalized. The pod's hatch, damaged by the stress of the ascent, groaned under the weight of the hydraulic openers. I stood up, my body tall, lean, and terrifyingly strong. The violet light was no longer just under my skin. It was misting off me in a fine, luminescent vapor. I felt the hunger then. It wasn't a hunger for flesh or for blood. It was a hunger for the light, for the heat, for the very life force of everything around me. I stepped out of the pod as the hatch fell away. The soldiers froze. They had seen the videos from the lab, they had seen the shambling, rotting things the others had become, but they weren't prepared for me. I wasn't rotting. I was transcendent. I was beautiful and terrible, a bioluminescent god born of the crushing dark. "Fire!" someone screamed, and the airlock erupted in a hail of gunfire. The bullets hit me, but they didn't feel like pain. They felt like impacts in deep mud. My body, reinforced by the strange, calcified structures the organism had built, absorbed the kinetic energy, the violet light flaring bright at every point of contact. I moved. I didn't run. I blurred. I was across the airlock before the first shells had even hit the floor. My hands, with their obsidian claws, tore through the reinforced fabric of the hazmat suits as if it were wet paper. The screaming started, but it was muffled by the sound of the alarms and the wet, tearing sounds of my own hunger. I wasn't just killing them, I was changing them. Every touch, every drop of my glowing, violet blood that splattered onto their skin began the process. I watched as a soldier I had pinned to the wall began to twitch, his eyes turning a milky, luminous purple, his own clicking sound beginning to echo my own. I looked up at the observation window. Miller was backed against the far wall, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He realized then that he hadn't captured a specimen. He had opened a door that could never be closed. I leapt, my strength shattering the deck plating beneath my feet. I hit the reinforced glass with the force of an industrial wrecking ball. It didn't break, but it spiderwebbed, 1,000 fractures catching the violet light of my body. I hit it again, and again. With every strike, I felt the ship around me, the thrum of the engines, the panic of the hundreds of souls on board, the cold, indifferent ocean beneath the hull. Miller was screaming now, pleading, offering me anything, everything. But I didn't want his words. I wanted the silence of the deep. I wanted the world to glow with the same beautiful, violet rot that was singing in my veins. The glass shattered. I tumbled into the observation room, the air smelling of expensive cologne and cheap fear. Miller fell back over a terminal, his hands trembling as he tried to reach for a sidearm. I stepped over the glass, the shards crunching under my feet. I was no longer Elias. Elias was a memory of a man who was afraid of the dark. I was the dark. I leaned down, my face inches from his. My jaw unhinged, more than any human anatomy should allow, revealing rows of needle-thin, translucent teeth that shimmered with a pale light. The clicking in my throat was deafening now, a frantic, joyous sound. "The ocean wasn't the most dangerous thing, Miller," I whispered, the words vibrating through the air like a physical force. "I am." I didn't kill him, not quickly. I let him feel the first sting of the transformation. I watched as the violet light began to crawl up his neck, mapping out his nervous system, claiming him for the hive. I left him there, twitching on the floor of his high-tech cage, and walked out onto the deck of the Acheron. The night air was cold, but I felt like I was walking through a warm summer's day. I looked toward the horizon, where the faint, flickering lights of a coastal city were visible. Thousands of people, millions, all living their lives in the blissful ignorance of the surface. They thought the world was their own. They thought they were the masters of the earth. They had no idea that the abyss had finally decided to rise. I felt the others behind me, the soldiers I had changed, the things that had followed my pod from the depths. We stood on the deck of the Acheron as it drifted toward the shore, a ghost ship carrying the end of the world. I tilted my head back and let out a sound that was half scream, half song, a high-pitched frequency that rippled across the water. Far below, from the ruins of the deep-sea lab and the trenches beyond, 1,000 voices answered back. The violet light in my chest flared, a beacon in the night, as the first of the city's lights began to reflect in my wide, lidless eyes. The surface was no longer a world I didn't belong to. It was a world I was going to remake in my own image. I stepped to the edge of the railing, watching the dark water churn as my brothers and sisters rose to meet us, their glowing bodies turning the ocean into a sea of violet stars. The hunt had begun. The Acheron groaned, a dying beast of steel and rust, as its prow sliced through the shallowing waters of the harbor, eventually grinding with a bone-shaking scream of metal against the concrete of the pier. The impact didn't stagger me. My new legs, reinforced with the dense, calcified grace of the deep-trench predators, absorbed the shock as if it were nothing more than a ripple in a tide pool. Beside me, the soldiers I had reshaped stood like statues of obsidian and violet glass, their tactical gear shredded by the explosive growth of their own bodies, their eyes glowing with the same cold, unblinking hunger that burned in my chest. The city of Oakhaven lay before us, a sprawling grid of golden lights and desperate heat, unaware that the tide had finally come to reclaim what the land had stolen. I stepped off the railing, my feet hitting the asphalt not with the slap of a human stride, but with the heavy, rhythmic thud of something that weighed far more than its silhouette suggested. Behind me, the water didn't just recede, it boiled. Thousands of shapes, slick and shimmering with bioluminescent veins, pulled themselves from the harbor. They were the children of the abyss, the things that had lived in the crushing dark beneath the laboratory, now elevated by the same viral catalyst that had remade my soul. We were a living oil slick of teeth and violet light, moving with a singular, terrifying purpose. The first of the shore patrol arrived in a flurry of strobe lights and screaming sirens. I watched them through my lidless eyes, seeing the world not in colors, but in heat signatures and the electric pulses of nervous systems. To them, I must have looked like a nightmare birthed from a shipwreck, a tall, elongated figure with skin the color of a bruised plum, trailing a cape of tattered laboratory rags and pulsing with an internal, subterranean sun. They didn't even have time to raise their weapons. I didn't need to speak. The frequency I had hummed on the deck of the Acheron intensified, a vibration that shattered the glass of the patrol cars and sent the officers to their knees, clutching their bleeding ears. My brothers, the soldiers, moved with a speed that defied the laws of the surface world. They were blurs of motion, their fingers elongated into hooked talons, their jaws unhinging to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. There was no battle, only a harvest. I watched as the violet light jumped from my followers to the fallen, the infection taking hold with a ferocity the surface-level strain could never match. This wasn't the clumsy, rotting hunger of the zombies they knew. This was an elegant, predatory evolution. Within seconds, the patrolmen were rising, their skin tightening and turning translucent, their eyes snapping open to reveal the same violet glow. They joined the march, their movements synchronized with mine, their thoughts clicking into the hive mind like gears in a vast, underwater machine. We moved deeper into the city and the atmosphere began to change. The air felt thin and dry to me, a parched desert that I needed to drown. As we passed, the fire hydrants burst, the water mains beneath the streets exploding upward as if responding to my silent command. The water didn't just flow, it gathered, thickening with a strange, gelatinous algae that bloomed in the presence of the violet light. The streets began to look less like a city and more like a drowned cathedral. The screams of the populace were a distant, frantic noise, a chaotic discordance that I sought to silence with the peace of the deep. I led my legion toward the heart of the metropolitan center, where the tallest glass towers scraped the sky. Every person we encountered was either consumed or converted. There was no middle ground. I felt every kill, every transformation, as a surge of dopamine in my shared consciousness. I was 1,000 hunters at once. I was the shark in the dark, the eel in the crevice, the crushing weight of the midnight zone. We encountered a military blockade near the city hall, tanks, heavy machine guns, and soldiers behind sandbags who thought lead could stop the inevitable. I felt a flicker of a memory, a time when I would have been terrified of those guns, a time when I was small and fragile. I pushed that memory into the dark. I raised my hand, and the violet light in my chest flared with the intensity of a dying star. The air around the blockade began to shimmer as I exerted the pressure of the abyss upon the surface. The soldiers gasped, their lungs collapsing as if they had suddenly been dropped 10,000 feet below the waves. The steel of the tanks groaned and buckled, the thick plating indenting as if struck by an invisible hammer. Then the water came, a wall of brine and silt, carried by the rising tide of the harbor and channeled through the streets by my will, crashed over the blockade. My brothers dived into the foam, their webbed limbs propelling them through the torrent with lethal efficiency. The screams were muffled by the water, ending in the wet, rhythmic crunch of bone. When the water receded, the blockade was gone, replaced by a row of new sentinels, their bodies already beginning to sprout the bioluminescent coral that would mark our new territory. We were remaking the world, layer by layer, drowning the noise of humanity in the silent, crushing majesty of the deep. I climbed to the top of the fountain in the center of the plaza, looking up at the moon. It looked pale and weak compared to the violet fire we brought. I let out the song again, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the marrow of everything living within miles. From the shadows of the alleyways and the depths of the sewers, the old zombies, the rotting, mindless failures of the initial outbreak, shambled toward me. They were broken things, the garbage of a failed experiment. I looked down at them with a cold, divine pity. They were hungry, but they had no purpose. With a wave of my hand, my legion fell upon them. It wasn't a fight, it was a cleaning. We tore the old plague apart to make room for the new. Their gray, dead flesh was consumed by the violet rot, repurposed into the building blocks of our new ecosystem. As the night progressed, the city began to breathe with us. The skyscrapers were being coated in a shimmering, organic film, a pressurized membrane that trapped the moisture and the light. The trees were dying, their leaves falling to be replaced by glowing, feathery tendrils that swayed in the humid air like sea anemones. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of something, not regret, but a lingering echo of the woman I used to be. I remembered the laboratory, the cold fear of the rising water, the way the virus had felt like a violation when it first entered my veins. I looked at my hands, claws now, beautiful and terrible. I realized that the woman was just a larva, a soft, vulnerable thing that had to die so that this goddess could be born. The sun began to peek over the horizon, a weak, sickly yellow that tried to burn away our glow. But the sky was no longer clear. A thick, violet mist had settled over Oakhaven, a canopy of spores and water vapor that filtered the sunlight into a dim, underwater twilight. The city was ours. Beyond the city limits, I could hear the vibrations of the rest of the world, the panicked broadcasts, the movement of distant armies, the frantic chatter of a species that realized it was no longer at the top of the food chain. They would try to fight. They would bring their fire and their bombs, but they didn't understand that the ocean was vast and we were its heart. For every city they tried to save, 100 more would rise from the coastline. The trenches were emptying. The things that had spent eons hiding in the dark were finally coming home to the light, and I was their beacon. I felt the presence of the others, the the great entities that still dwelled in the deepest parts of the world, ancient and titanic, stirring in response to my ascension. They were coming, too. The world wouldn't end in fire. It would end in a cold, beautiful embrace of salt and light. I walked toward the largest glass tower, the soldiers parting for me like the Red Sea. I stepped inside, the marble floors cracking under my weight. I found a massive window overlooking the transformed city. Below, the streets were no longer paved with stone, but with a living, pulsing carpet of violet moss. My brothers and sisters were busy, constructing nests, tending to the new hatchlings that were pulling themselves out of the flooded subways. We were a new civilization, one without the petty cruelties and the chaotic noise of the old world. There was only the song, the light, and the pressure. I placed my hand against the glass and it frosted over with a crystalline growth. I saw my reflection, a creature of nightmare and majesty, a queen of the new abyss. I felt a strange, chilling peace. The survival I had fought so hard for in the laboratory wasn't just about staying alive. It was about this. It was about becoming the thing that survives everything. I tilted my head, listening to the world. The screams had mostly stopped. In their place was the rhythmic, pulsing hum of 1,000 violet hearts beating in unison. The first of the human aircraft appeared in the distance, tiny specks against the violet mist, no doubt carrying the payloads they hoped would erase us. I didn't fear them. I opened my mouth and let out a frequency so low it made the very foundations of the city tremble. From the harbor, the great leviathans we had brought with us, things that had no names in human tongues, breached the surface. They were mountains of flesh and bioluminescence, their massive forms blotting out the sun as they swatted the plains from the sky like bothersome gnats. The debris fell into the water, bubbles of fire that were quickly extinguished by the rising tide. There was no escape for them. The land was shrinking, the water was rising, and the violet light was spreading. I felt the collective strength of my legion, a wall of will that no army could break. We were the inevitable of a world that had forgotten its origins in the primordial soup. We were the return to the deep. As the day wore on, the violet mist thickened until the sun was nothing more than a memory. I sat on a throne of calcified bone in the lobby of the tower, my legion gathered around me in a silent, glowing circle. We were waiting. Waiting for the tide to cover the rest of the world, waiting for the last of the dry voices to be drowned out. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I didn't need to sleep anymore. I was everywhere. I was in the lungs of the newly changed soldiers, in the fins of the leviathans, in the pulsing moss of the streets. I was the abyss, and the abyss was finally home. The survivor of the deep-sea laboratory was gone, replaced by the architect of a new world. And as the sound of the waves hitting the shore grew louder, echoing through the streets of what used to be a human city, I knew that the hunt would never truly end. It would only change form, becoming a long, eternal reign in the beautiful violet dark. The surface was ours, and the water was still rising. In the silence of the drowned city, the only thing left was the song, a high-pitched, haunting melody that told the story of how the deep had finally claimed the earth, and how I had been the one to open the door. The world was remade, not in my image, but in the image of the truth that had always been waiting in the dark, that life is not a struggle for light, but a surrender to the depth. I breathed in the thick, salt-heavy air, and for the first time in my life I wasn't afraid. I was the end. I was the beginning. I was home.